Good morning, sir. I'm Mrs. Nelly Lanestosa. My topic for today is about the expenditure process. Under the expenditure process are the elements of expenditure process, expenditure and educational process, and school expenditure and economy. What is expenditure process? Process of creating a requisition or purchase order to goods or services incurred by the district. After the purchase order is created by the district, it is sent to the vendor supplying the goods and services. A check will be issued to the vendor for payment of the invoice. Elements of the expenditure process. Expenditure on education has continued to rise as a result of the rapid expansion of the education system at all levels. The fact that remains the need and demands in education sector are limitless, but the funds to satisfy them are limited, and therefore the imperative of budgeting in order to prioritize these needs. The school management relies heavily on a good budgetary system for effective actualization of the strategic goals. Thus, the identification of school goals, allocation of cost, and their execution or implementation holds the key to achieving these goals. This requires planning, which is crucial for schools to ensure that resources are used effectively to improve student achievement. The budget is the product of a collaborative process requiring a clear understanding of the school goals for improving student outcomes and its plans for achieving them. Budgeting is a process of preparing a statement of the anticipated income and the proposed expenditure. It is an act of target setting. Educational institutions design programs and courses of study. Programs can effectively be implemented only with availability of funds. It is critical, especially not that the government budget for education lies far below. Expenditure and educational process. Any relationship between these multiple items of expenditures and outcomes of schooling is defined by the interactions between pupils and teachers, which most existing studies treat as a black box. Economics has no theory modeling the behavior of either pupils or teachers, and has just begun investigating key issues such as pedagogy and the contents of the curriculum. As a result, any estimation of the relationship between education, expenditures, and outcomes faces the need to take crucial and observable variables into account. Information about the level and distribution of education expenditures does not provide a complete representation of a school system. As Drest and Saran, among others, have argued, school systems, besides resources consist of incentives and values. Economics is well equipped to study monetary incentives and recent developments in the economics of education field have gone away from the estimation of the education production function to the analysis of incentives provided to teachers under various school management types, notably the impact of decentralization and privatization. The economic study of the political and cultural values embedded in school systems, however, is in its infancy. School expenditure and economy. The economic approach to the outcomes of school education. The contemporary economic approach to education started developing from the late 1950s onward with Jacob Menster's application of human capital theory to the measurement of the economic return to education as the impact that the number of years of schooling an individual receive as on her earnings. While this view was challenged, notably through the screening and signaling models proposed in the 1970s, the returns to education literature has kept on innovating conceptually and methodologically, and it is now established that human capital acquired through schooling has a causal impact on earnings that can be measured econometrically. Recent critical contributions seek to implement this approach by proposing new theoretical derivations of the returns to education as human capital and considering other dimensions of school education than human capital and rather than to replace it. In stark contrast, the literature which from the late 1960s onward and especially in 1980s and 1990s has sought to measure the impact of school inputs and educational outcomes has failed to reach a consensus on either the conceptual framework that should be used for the results of existing studies. Indeed, the educational production function approach, which dominates this literature, is not based on a proper theoretical model, but on a mere metaphor, an analogy between the functioning of a school and the production process of a firm. Although dozens of papers and hundreds of estimates have accumulated over the last 3 or 4 decades, no empirical regularity comparable to estimates of the returns to education has emerged. Indeed, the same special issue of a leading journal recently included 2 surveys written each by a major contributor to the field and covering the same sets of studies while reaching diametrically op- op- opposite conclusions. Although a wealth of precise methodological arguments were exchanged, political considerations obviously underlie these exchanges. The editors of the journal prudently avoided taking sides. In the end, after having read such surveys, whether one considers that there is a significant and positive relationship between various school resource variables and cognitive achievement in either the United States or developing countries as a whole is as much a matter of belief and opinion as it is of knowledge. Providing a clear account of evidence which economists have produced about the relationship between educational expenditures and outcomes thus seems an arduous task which requires examining the relevance of the conventional economic approach to school education as a technical relationship between inputs and outputs, as well as methodological issues in implementing the education production function framework. Indeed, it is easy to see why one may not expect the kind of linear relationship between the resources of schools and the test results of their students that underlies most of the empirical literature to exist. Educational expenditures are distributed across sectors: primary versus secondary and higher education, public versus private schools, centralized versus decentralized school systems, and over inputs, teacher salaries and training, teaching learning materials, buildings, management, and inspection. Educational outcomes are extraordinarily diverse, and there is a great deal of arbitrariness in their definition. Because of its early emphasis on the productivity impact of the human capital acquired through schooling. Economics has focused on the number of years of schooling and other measures of attainment, the quantity of education, and on the achievement of so-called cognitive skills, be they basic literacy and numeracy or a more advanced mastery of language, mathematics, and science, which are relatively easy to quantify as test results, the quality of education. Other social sciences, however, have emphasized the different dimensions of schooling. Example, its impact on the psyche and the socialization of the students, which were key preoccupations when modern school systems were established from the late 18th century onwards. Economics, which is usually silent about this history, has by and large neglected these dimensions, although some convergence with social psychology, sociology, and history may be about to take place. Any relationship between these multiple items of expenditures and outcomes of schooling is defined by the interactions between pupils and teachers, which most existing studies treat as a black box. Economics has no theory modeling the behavior of either pupils or teachers, and has just begun investigating key issues such as pedagogy and the contents of the curriculum. As a result, any estimation of the relationship between education expenditures and outcomes faces the need to take crucial unobservable variables into account. Information about the level and distribution of economic expenditures does not provide a complete representation of a school system. How budgets are spent in the expenditure context. Distributing school funding presents an overview of how OECD reviewed countries distribute school funding between different levels of administration and to individual schools, focusing on the design of effective allocation mechanisms for the funding of both current and capital expenditure. Thank you and God bless.